Hi, my name is Ben DiDomenices. I'm presenting now the PowerPoint, a PDF file for my poster for the conference, the interdisciplinary conference in Greece. And I thought I would, since I'm participating only online, that I would prepare a poster and then present it for 20 minutes here in this recorded Zoom video presentation. So let me share the screen and show you what I've also loaded up on the website, and that is my PowerPoint presentation, which is in one single PDF file, this image. And you can see the title of it has evolved a bit since I submitted the proposal months ago, and it's now identified as the social identity dynamics of Gramscian hegemony, construction, building public goods through nation-state creation, commodification, institutionalization of status stereotypes. And the theoretical framework that I'm using for the book, for the presentation, for the paper, which is, as I stated there, is in press. So I can send a copy if anybody's interested. It might not come out until late this year. The paper builds upon my interest in nationalism and image theory to try to explore the role of commodification and consumption in the construction of what is referred to in the literature as Gramscian hegemony, and trying to relate the tendency of nation states to create markets and standardization of statewide institutions, the creation of institutions on a statewide level within the boundaries of the territorial boundaries of the nation state. So I'm focusing here on nation states, not so much on multinational states like the old Soviet Union or the old former communist Yugoslavia, or multi-ethnic states like post-colonial states in Africa or Asia. I'm more interested in the Weberian ideal typical nation states of Europe and Asia, including Germany, France, in Asia, China, of course, Russia, also Japan, Poland. These are all, and the United States. These are all examples of nation states, and that is covered. Conceptualization of nation states is offered in Cottom and Cottom's 2001 book, "The Political Behavior of Nation States," which is listed in the references in the paper, and they also present in that book by Cottom and Cottom, Nationalism and Politics, a typology of images or stereotypes that human beings are prone to engage in collectively on a collective level. Nation states are particularly prone to stereotype targets of foreign policy in terms of tendencies or orientations that emerge, including, for example, enemy stereotype image or degenerate image in the case of perceiving opportunity. Enemy, of course, in perceiving an enemy, a threatening enemy that is roughly perceived as roughly equal in terms of culture and capability level. That, of course, characterized the American prevailing view in the post-war Cold War era, with during the Cold War towards the Soviet Union, versus other stereotypic predispositions, including barbarian stereotype, colonial, imperial stereotypes. Those are all negative stereotypes, of course, and there's I should see the colonial stereotype is one in which you see opportunity. Another positive stereotype is ally, right? The enemy of my enemy is my friend, the stereotype, and a perceived ally against the shared common perceived threat in a positive stereotype. Of course, these stereotypes are simplifications. They're simplifications in perception of the outside world, processing vast amounts of data in accordance with pre-existing notions or assumptions that can become institutionalized. And of course, I think that in some other work that I've covered, that I presented, that reflects the Cold War transference of Cold War imagery towards Moscow today. and also towards China, which is an issue for conflict resolution, peaceful conflict resolution in international relations, which is my background, because I'm a political science professor at the International Studies Department here in South Korea. So I'm working and living in an institution within South Korea. South Korea is a state that was largely institutionalized and created during the Cold War, and America's containment strategy against the perceived Russian version of Nazi Germany, as Ronald Reagan, almost 40 years ago, described the Soviet Union in his Evil Empire speech, the Evil Empire, the image that he described so wonderfully, so excellently, in terms of this articulation of the diabolical enemy image that's covered in his Kadam book. So how does this relate to consumption and commodification? In terms of control systems that are in place, nation states have a control advantage in terms of their ability to mobilize the resources within the society that exist in their countries, because they are able to appeal to nationalism. And nationalism includes the institutionalization of images that archetypes. Including, for example, through the propagation of archetypes of aesthetic achievement, aesthetic beauty, of achievement, that are based often, on elements of pre-existing assumptions regarding of ideals, status ideals, and then these become ascriptively internalized, typically within a society like the United States, where people are controlled by the authorities and habitually assume that the authorities are the authorities because they're the authorities. They're there, so they must be obeyed because they're the authorities. In other words, it's how they became the authorities, or whether or not their authority is legitimate, is habitually assumed to be legitimate. And this is normative habitual control. And the legitimacy and status of the authorities to be the authorities is accepted through the institutionalized framework for selecting the authorities. And these notions of ascription versus achievement, achievement, of course, is another source of status, which is basically through the, acquiring status through doing better than others or appearing better than others. There is reflected in this dialectical relationship in these institutionalized so-called developed nation states like the United States and other so-called developed nation states, developed states, in a dialectical nature and relationship that's covered, for example, in this book, this Writing the Ways of Culture, Trompenars and Hampton Turner textbook. It's now in its 4th edition. I referenced the 3rd edition in the book, in the paper, because this came out after I got the paper accepted for publication. But this dialectical relationship between achievement and inscription for the basis of awarding status to actors within society is reflected in these assumptions about what does it mean to be the ideal American, or the ideal German, or the ideal Russian, or the ideal whatever. And of course, these ideals are romantic, often romantic archetypes of the, for example, the American case, the rugged cowboy, the rugged individualist cowboy figure living out on the range, that is not dependent upon anybody, takes care of themselves. Of course, these are all archetypes. These are all stereotypes. Archetypes is another word for stereotype in this framework that I'm using and presenting here. And they are by their nature, they're often typically based upon what we call racism, sexism, ableism, ageism, and all of these stereotypical images that relate self versus other, and therefore serve to marginalize the other. And of course, the extent to which these are internalized, then these become the habitual notions and symbols that can become a reservoir for mobilization during a time of crisis, when the nation state goes to sees itself at war, for example. And so we call this the rally around the flag phenomenon. That typically U.S. presidents, because they are the pinnacle, the representative of the state and the form of the government apparatus that is assumed to represent the nation or our national identity as Americans or Russians or Germans or Polish or whatever, then they can manipulate those those symbols, those stereotypes, those archetypes to mobilize society against the perceived threat. And of course, some of the drawbacks of this, of course, is that it becomes maybe more. It's easier for the leader of the state apparatus to get the benefit of the doubt from the public, to have greater decisional latitude to engage in foreign adventures like invading Iraq after invading Afghanistan after September 11, 2001, but then withdrawing becoming much more difficult, because then becomes an issue of humiliation. And of course, the difficulties of pulling out of Afghanistan for 20 years or pulling out of Vietnam are examples of this. And so in terms of how this relates to public goods and creation of Gramscian hegemony, again, Gramscian hegemony is defined in the literature as the creation of as I stated here, that the provision of public goods is closely related to the concept of hegemony in the literature, highlighting the intersection between global and national capitalist political economic evolution. Post-structuralist hegemony theory is rooted in the Gramscian notion that hegemony rests on the ability to universalize the particular interests of a group as a socioeconomic and political structure. So in other words, how do you convince people that the particular interest of a ruling class is the universal interest, is the public good, that the order and structure and authority that the government represents, that is itself a public good? How do you convince people that represents the public interest of the community? So it's about an issue of state building and public identity, community building. What Benedict Anderson called 40 years ago, an imagined community, right? How do you convince people, or that in their imaginary, that's a common used term, that they are members of a state, of a national community, and to go beyond that to create a global hegemony, right? A global hegemony, or the example I highlight in the paper is a European hegemony, right? The European Union is an example, is a living laboratory of the creation of regional international hegemonies that are building upon the existing nation states that are the foundation of the European Union. You know, that the European Union relies critically upon the ability of the authorities of those states, of those nation states, to harness the capabilities of those so-called developed nation states to create something, construct a new hegemony that on the basis of the building blocks of the nation states of the European Union, that have to be constructed to create something that's more than the sum of its parts, right? It's not just a bunch of building blocks. They have to be constructed together to produce something that's more than the sum of its parts. And so that's and of course this is happening within the context of American hegemony. We are seeing, that the very important role in being played in creating this European identity, this European hegemony, this European public community, and the public goods of European securities under the broader umbrella of American hegemony, and that is heavily reliant upon having a common adversary. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. So this point has been highlighted, for example, with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that one scholar, internet marathon program that was on Ponairs for a while, highlighted that we owe a debt of gratitude to the Ukrainians because they've reminded us what it means to be European and in the West and democratic. And of course, that's unfortunate. That's requires that we have a common enemy in the form of Russia, a common adversary in the form of Russia. Given, of course, the European Union is supposed to be a peace strategy for peace in Europe. And the integration of Ukraine has played a critical role in this conflict escalation between Russia and Moscow and the United States and its perceived proxy, the European Union, as the prevailing view within Moscow. But so I explored in the paper the processes by which the creation of these ideal images or stereotypes, archetypes, and the propagation of them in the process of creating statewide institutions and in the so-called developed nation states is rooted in these predispositions towards status acquisition in utilizing the Cottom and Cottom's framework, which is built upon Henri Tajfeld's social identity theory, right? That human beings have various identities, including the tendency of a social identity, in which individuals tend to place themselves within groups and compare and evaluate their own status in relation to the status of the in-group that they self-identify with. And of course, they have multiple self-identity in-groups, from family to corporate entity that they work for, or to university that they graduated from, or the state or region, and of course national identities. And they can respond in different ways, including the three different broad general strategies, right? One is to social mobility, so to leave the in-group and join the positively perceived out-group. In response to the negative status evaluation of self versus other, leave the in-group and join the superior out-group. And that's, social mobility is the name of that strategy, right? And of course, that's social mobility is highlighted and romanticized in the United States. That the crossing class boundaries is feasible, although racial boundaries are much more difficult, much more opaque, and difficult to cross. The second strategy, of course, is social competition, right? That your gain is my loss is your gain, and that's, of course, for example, regulating sports competitions, is one way by which to encourage social competition. And that notion of regulation, of course, you can't have this kind of sports competition without rules. There's got to be agreed rules, and of course, the authorities enforce those rules. And in the process of regulating that social competition, we produce desirable societal outcomes. We produce market competition. We produce new products. We produce we mobilize resources, particularly in developed capitalist societies. And then, of course, the third strategy is social creativity in response to a negative evaluation of myself versus other. That social creativity means changing the criteria upon which I'm comparing myself with the out group that I am viewing myself as, our main group is perceived as negatively. How can I change the evaluation of the status evaluation of myself? I change the evaluation criteria. So I can say, well, that team is more, they win more games, but my hockey team has more fun. We're the more fun team. We enjoy our activity more. So again, trying to change the evaluation criteria. And of course, the effective nation state in terms the effective nation state in the form of the authorities that control the government, they tightly regulate, more or less regulate those processes of social competition, so they don't become violent, right? Because that's not particularly useful for mobilizing resources if violence is employed. And also they regulate social creativity and social mobility, but social creativity is an interesting process because the state and the authorities respond to social movements. So for example, we see, a great example that the African-American and the African-American community in the United States is historically marginalized and segregated, marginalized. The so-called social deviance in this form, and I'm using it in a Durkheimian notion, this term social deviance, then can become a source of creativity, social creativity and culture and monetization and consumption. So for example, hip hop music. I mean, rap, everybody around the whole world knows about rap music, which I think it's safe to say is an African-American community creation that grew out of this experience of marginalization and segregation. And the music, the culture, and other forms of social deviance that can be that the authorities can respond to and utilize for their own control purposes. Like, for example, in this dialectic process of responding to social movement challenges. For example, the feminist movement, then trying to respond to it by expanding the labor force, which is useful for the economic and political resources of the society and that the authorities control. And so I describe this I explore these processes in the paper, and again, thinking about how does this relate to the creation of transnational, international identity communities in terms of social mobility, social creativity, and social competition. In a world of increasing awareness of interdependency, right? Interdependency, the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic is just always, of course, put in many people's direct line of sight the fact that we are interdependent, that what happens in Africa or China can affect me a month later in the United States in terms of having new travel restrictions because of the new latest variant of the Corona-19 virus mutating elsewhere. And so this awareness of this interdependency, which has always been there, becomes more and more deeply and widely propagated, and actors globalize and respond to that. And of course, state authorities also are trying to exploit those resources that for influence and prosperity and wealth that globalization provides, and cooperate and collaborate like a form of European Union to get the benefits out of interdependency for collective benefits and individual benefits, while of course trying to regulate it more or less effectively or ineffectively, as in the case, for example, of how European integration definitely has been a contributor to this war between the outbreak of war between Russia and Ukraine. So that's what I explore in the paper, and I thought it was a great. I thought it was something of an important piece for me, because I really did. I've always been looking to see how I can explore this notion of social Gramscian hegemony as a notion of the state in relation to nationalism. So I think that's where I will stop there, and I will look forward to any of your comments.